Adolf Hitler had been planning the invasion of Poland since April that year. The operation had a name, Fall Weiss, or Case White. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had been quietly moved to the Polish border over the summer, disguised in many cases as routine military exercises. The build-up was enormous. Roughly 1.5 million German troops were now positioned along the border that stretched from the north in what was the German-controlled territory of the near Baltic Sea all the way down to the south through Slovakia. Germany had two massive army groups ready to move. Army Group North, under General Fedor von Pock, was positioned in Pomerania and East Prussia, ready to drive south into Polish territory and close off the narrow strip of land known as the Polish Corridor. Army Group South, the larger of the two, was commanded by General Gerd von Rundstedt and was massed along the southern border stretching through Silesia into Slovakia. Together, the two forces would attack from opposite directions, like a pair of jaws closing around the Polish army from the north and the south at once. The plan was to move fast, get behind defensive lines, cut off entire divisions from retreat, destroy them into the field before they regroup in the coherent defensive front. The Polish military was not blind to what was coming. They had been watching the German troop movements. Poland had begun mobilizing its own forces in the last days of August, but the mobilization was slow, badly under-equipped compared to what Germany had assembled, and it was further complicated by pressure from Britain and France to hold off on full mobilization so as not give Hitler an excuse to claim provocation. In Berlin that morning, Hitler met with his top military commanders. The invasion had already been postponed once, on August 25th, when Hitler learned that Britain had signed a formal mutual assistance pact with Poland. That news made him hesitate briefly. He feared that Britain and France might actually honor their commitment this time. His foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, assured him they would not. Ribbentrop had a long history of misleading Britain. He had served as German ambassador to London from 1936 to 1938, and he was genuinely convinced that the British would never fight. He believed that the ruling class he had met was soft and would always find a reason to avoid confrontation. He had told Hitler that this over and over again. It was the same thinking that had led him, back in 1935, to personally negotiate the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which he presented as proof that Britain had accepted German rearmament and would accommodate Hitler's ambitions. He was wrong then too, but the agreement had encouraged a pattern of wishful thinking about the British intentions that ran all the way to the top of the Nazi government. On August 31, 1939, Ribbentrop was wrong again. His assurances to Hitler that Britain would stay out of the war would prove to be one of the most consequential diplomatic miscalculations of the entire century. Hitler set the invasion time for 4:45 in the morning on September 1. The order went out that afternoon. Meanwhile, something calculated and deeply sinister was being organized inside Germany. At a small radio station near the Polish border in the town of Gleiwitz, a group of SS men under the command of Reinhard Heydrich were preparing a staged incident, a false flag operation that the Nazis would use as justification for the invasion. The operation had a simple structure. German SS soldiers dressed in Polish army uniforms would seize the Gleiwitz radio station. They would broadcast a short provocative message in Polish, fire some shots, and then leave. When they left, they would leave behind bodies. These bodies were prisoners taken from German concentration camps. It is worth pausing here for a moment, because some people assume that the camps were a secret in 1939, something the public would not have known about. This is not quite right. The first camp, Dachau, opened in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power. The Nazi press announced its existence openly. It was presented as a place of forced labor and political education for enemies of the state. Neighbors in German towns and cities saw people being taken away. Returned prisoners sometimes spoke in past terms about conditions inside. The existence of the camps was known. What was not widely understood was the full depth of the brutality inside them, and what they would eventually become. The systematic industrial mass murder of the Holocaust was still years away. In 1939, the camps were places of terror, forced labor, starvation, torture, and death by abuse and execution. But the gas chambers and the final solution had not yet been set in motion. Most ordinary Germans understood the camps as places where the state punished its enemies. They did not imagine, or chose not to imagine, what the punishment actually looked like. The prisoners selected for the Gleiwitz operation had their lives taken away beforehand. They were dressed in Polish uniforms, their bodies arranged at the scene to look like soldiers killed in a firefight. In the internal SS documents coordinating the operation, these men were not referred to as prisoners or even as victims. They were referred as Konserven, canned goods. That word used in bureaucratic planning memos to refer to human beings who were alive when the memos were written and dead by the time the operation ran. That tells you something important about the moral world that the SS had constructed for itself. These were not people to be killed, they were materials to be used. They were assets. They were inventory. The language was not an accident. It was the way a system talks about people when it has decided they are not people anymore. The word did not become publicly known until after the war had ended, when the captured SS records entered into evidence at the Nuremberg trials. But the act it described happened on August 31 in 1939, and happened to real men whose names are mostly lost to history. The Gleiwitz operation was just one of several such staged incidents organized the night along the German-Polish border. Others targeted a German customs post and a German forestry station. The goal was to produce a set of incidents that German newspapers and radio stations could point to as evidence that Poland had struck first, that Germany was the victim and that the invasion was self-defense. The operation ran as planned. The SS men seized the station, broadcasted their message, fired the shots, left their bodies, and withdrew. German news agencies had been briefed in advance and were ready to run the story the moment it was finished. Within hours, the German press was reporting Polish aggression along the border. The bait was set. The story was live. Across the border in Warsaw, the Polish government was still hoping that diplomacy might save them. British and French ambassadors were still meeting the Polish officials. The Polish foreign minister, Joseph Beck, had spent much of the summer trying to hold firm without provoking Germany into an early strike. He had some reason, even now, to believe that an alliance with Britain and France might deter Hitler. The belief was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. In London and Paris, the governments were doing what they had been doing for most of the 1939, hoping the situation would somehow resolve itself without requiring them to go to war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had built his reputation on the idea that Hitler could be reasoned with. He had been proven wrong at Munich the previous year, when Germany was given the Sudetenland and then simply took the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. But even now, on the last day of August 1939, there were still people in London who thought a conference might be arranged, that something could be salvaged. By the time night fell over the German-Polish border, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were settling into the final positions. Equipment was checked one last time. Officers distributed orders and maps. Many of the men in those positions were in the late teens and early 20s, part of a generation that had grown up entirely inside the Nazi state, raised in the Hitler Youth, fed a diet of nationalism, injustice, and the idea that Germany had been stabbed in the back and needed to reclaim its strength. They had been told Poland was the aggressor. Many of them believed it entirely. Conscription had been reintroduced in Germany in 1935, so most of these men had not chosen to be there in any meaningful sense. They had no choice. They had been called up. The Wehrmacht by this point numbered close to 4 million men, and a great many of the frontline troops had no combat experience at all. Some of them, in those last quiet hours before dawn, perhaps thought that Poland would see the size of the force assembled against it and simply capitulate, that the guns would not actually need to fire. Little did they know, they were about to start one of the bloodiest wars in the world history. The day is September 1, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had been sitting at the port of Danzig for just over a week, opened fire on the Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte. The sound of those guns was the first sound of the Second World War. The ship's arrival in Danzig on August the 25th had been presented as a courtesy visit, officially planned around the memorial ceremony honoring German sailors who died in the First World War. It was a plausible cover. Danzig was a free city under the League of Nations supervision, with a large ethnic German population, and German naval visits were not unusual. The ship's crew spent days on deck, waving at locals, attending official events, looking every bit like sailors on a goodwill trip. What was happening below decks and in the ship's logistical preparation was a different matter entirely. The Schleswig-Holstein had been positioned with deliberate precision so that its guns pointed directly at the Polish garrison at Westerplatte, a small peninsula where around 200 Polish soldiers were stationed to guard a military supply depot. Polish intelligence suspected the visit was not what it appeared to be, but could not prove it and could not act on suspicion alone. They watched and waited. So did the crew of the Schleswig-Holstein. The two attacks were coordinated to begin simultaneously. The guns at Danzig and the aircraft in the sky arriving together as a single opening blow, designed to give Poland no moment to understand what was happening before it was already happening everywhere at once. The Luftwaffe had been ordered to destroy the Polish Air Force on the ground before it could respond, targeting airfields, communication lines, roads, and rail junctions. The aim was to blind Poland and cut off its ability to move troops and supplies from the very first minutes of the war. Polish commanders, however, had anticipated the possibility of a German airstrike and had moved many of their aircraft to smaller, less obvious airfields in the days before. Polish fighter pilots were in the air by mid-morning. They were shooting down German planes before the day was out. On the ground, German armored divisions crossed the border at multiple points. This was the first large-scale test of what the world would come to call Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, though the Germans themselves did not widely use the term. The idea was to combine fast-moving tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support into one coordinated punch. Rather than advancing steadily across a wide front, German commanders drove their armored spearheads through the weakest points in the Polish lines, broke through and then pushed deep into the rear, cutting off the defending units from the supply lines and from each other, collapsing the front and not by grinding through it but getting behind it. It is worth noting just how alien this style of warfare looked compared to what the world had seen in 1914 to 1918. The First World War had been defined by immovable front lines, by men dying for yards of mud, by the idea that the defensive power of trenches and machine guns made any rapid advance essentially impossible. 20 years later, on September the 1st, those assumptions were being shattered in a single morning. Everything the world thought it knew about how wars were fought had been proven wrong. Poland was already bleeding from a dozen directions at once. The guns at Westerplatte were still firing. The skies over Warsaw were already full of German aircraft. And in London and Paris, governments that had promised to stand with Poland were sitting in meeting rooms, hoping that someone would find a reason not to. In the following parts, we will follow the invasion through its brutal conclusion. The political crisis in Britain that nearly brought down a government in a single evening. The moment France finally acted, and why it was too little and far too late. The secret deal that brought Soviet tanks rolling into Poland from the east, and the question that hung over everything in those first few days. Was there a moment, any moment at all, where this could have been stopped?